Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Fronteras, a Changing America. I'm Anthony Moreno. Dr. Giovanna Dell'Orto from the University of Minnesota recently visited New Mexico State University to present her book, Reporting at the Southern Borders. It offers insight from leading North American and European journalists who have covered immigration. Dr. Dell'Orto joins us now to talk about her book. Dr. Dell'Orto, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'd like to hear a little bit about your experience and also how that inspired this venture.
Well, let me start with a bit of a personal angle, if you will. As you can probably hear, and so can your viewers, I have an accent. Obviously, I was born in Italy. So first of all, I'm an immigrant myself. I came here 20 years ago, and it's been wonderful to be here. But I've always felt personally invested in this question of immigration. I then started working as a professional journalist. I was working for the Associated Press, including in Phoenix, Arizona, covering the border. And that was a fantastic experience, and I felt I wanted to go into more depth, but also explain to the general audience what it is exactly the border reporters do. So this very much was the genesis, if you will, of the book. Once I switched over to academia and started teaching at the University of Minnesota, I wanted to use my experience as a reporter as well as my experience as a researcher and bring those in dialogue, because very often that's a voice that's not necessarily heard. So the idea was to do this sort of bring in dialogue researchers, academic researchers, journalists, as well as some NGOs, all talking about how can we better fulfill our role of creating a more civil, democratic dialogue about immigration, both along the US-Mexican border, so the southern border of the United States, and comparing it with what is very interestingly similar, and that's the border along the Mediterranean, if you will, between the southern European countries and North Africa.
So when we're talking about immigration, what is it about the discourse that you notice as, as a journalist and also as a researcher?
Well, look, first of all, I think the public tends to be vastly uninformed about even just some of the basic data. And that's one of the things that's really interesting. Public opinion sometimes is driven by images that are, the people running across the Rio Grande or the desert or Yuma, which is actually a relatively small percentage of the population. Same thing with Europe. You have all of these images, harrowing images of boats, of people coming across, drowning, etc. And not to diminish that, that's a very big concern. But that's not the whole picture. So what we're really trying to go is to go beyond the image of, again, somebody with a backpack coming across the desert or somebody, on a crowded little boat, and expand it in explaining what actually is the nuance in the entire discourse. Now, it's interesting that there's a lot of focus in both Europe as well as in the United States on immigration itself. That's a very important topic. There is immigration reform possible. It's driving voters in many ways. But again, it tends to focus on just the border without including everything else. And that's what we're trying to show with the book, that there are many other voices that might not be necessarily a part of this dialogue yet.
So what are those voices that aren't part of the dialogue that you think are?
Well, we like to think of it as a series of borders. So yes, you have the frontier, quite literally a line in the sand in many places along the southwest between two countries, or for that matter, the sea, the Mediterranean Sea in Europe. But you also have the question of, once you made it physically across this border, what are you going to do? Which language are you going to speak? Where are you going to work? Where are your kids going to go to school? All, if you will, a set of borders that are much more difficult to write about as journalists, because they're not this striking image of somebody running across a vast expanse of desert. So we really wanted to talk about the second step. How is immigration changing, really reshaping our societies? And let me just toss out, if I may, a couple of quick data that I think are really fascinating. Up to 1960, 75% of people in the United States who were born elsewhere came from Europe. 75%. By 2009, 80% of people who were born elsewhere, who were residing in the United States, were coming from either Asia or Latin America. So these are huge changes. Again, I'm not implying this is, bad or good. Obviously, it's just a very dramatic change. That's a hard thing to cover.
Well, you speak of that change, and how does that have an impact on understanding the media that we're viewing? when, most of the people may have a European ancestry, and they have a different, perhaps, colonial view of understanding immigration compared to the recent data that you're coming up with.
Exactly, and that's always really the tricky question. The more visible the difference is, whether it's again linguistic or racial, etc., the easier it is to write about it. But that's again a very reductive kind of view, and we don't really want to go there. And that's unfortunately what you see very often in a lot of the less quality media, both here and in Europe. It tends to be the focus on again things like accents or skin color, or all of these kind of issues. When we think that it really should go well beyond that and address really the vast socio-cultural, political changes that immigration brings. Now, one thing that is really interesting, and that many of the journalists that contributed to this book have talked about, regardless of whether they're working in France or Italy or the UK or the US, they've all said it's really, really difficult to even begin to say, how is immigration changing us as the host country, without going into the whole question of, well, then they shouldn't, and they shouldn't be here. So that was a really big challenge. How do you address this very big socio-political change without giving a voice to the really extreme fringes that might have very specific agendas to pursue?
Wow. Here along the border, I mean, there's, you have two different sides, you have two different views. What are some of the things about for example, Mexican side of the border that people in the United States need to understand when they're viewing the coverage?
Right. Well, first of all, I'd like to start with a couple of things. One is from the perspective of the restrictionist perspective, where they'll say things like, we need to secure the border, which of course I sympathize with. But one of the things that I think we need to realize is that securing the border means not only a law enforcement perspective, but making it actually safe for people to cross. And that's a very big issue. I don't think people realize just how vastly controlled it is by criminal gangs, literally, the cartels, etc., that clearly are controlling not only the drug smuggling routes, but obviously side by side the human trafficking routes. So the more we have securitized certain parts, say in Texas, the eastern Texas as well as California, that has really funneled most migrants through the most dangerous parts of the desert and parts of this region, which has made it very insecure for them. So you can think of it security from a law enforcement kind of perspective, also security for people. And that's, I think, a very important piece that gets sort of lost in the conversation. The second piece, and look, let me be personal here for a second. I took a group of students from the University of Minnesota to Spain and Morocco to talk about, again, journalism and immigration in this context. And Spain and Morocco are 14 kilometers apart. So yes, it's sea, but it's a very small distance. And one of the things that everybody said once we got to Morocco was, oh, I guess I had never seen this level of poverty. Now I see why they want to leave. And I think that sometimes we tend to say, oh, they're just coming here because, they're breaking the law, etc., without really putting a lot of focus on what people might be leaving from and just how difficult it is, the life that they're leaving behind might be and what the connections might be. So that's something else that we tend to forget about. Immigration means emigration from somewhere else. And that's a part of the story that's very hard to do, and increasingly hard to do, unfortunately, as there is less and less coverage of foreign news by the majority of US media.
What about the immigration process in general? I mean, we really get just a picture of a wall or immigration or people, migrants traveling the border, but we don't really get much of a view of, the court process,
right,
or the process to go through to get your documents that you need in order to move around in this society.
This was one of my biggest frustrations when I was working as a border reporter, that whenever I tried to do a story about legal immigration or just going through the system, it was almost impossible to do. It's not very dramatic, let's face it. It doesn't make for good TV, or for that matter, for good front pages if you're talking about, the visa process. I mean, I realize that's horribly boring, and yet it's absolutely an essential part. And that's something else that really came across from our book, and what the journalists were saying was, we need to find the most dramatic images because that's what hooks the reader. So even if sometimes I had an Italian journalist who's a correspondent for Italy's largest paper in Washington, he travels to this region very often, and he would say, I try to use references from John Wayne movies as much as I can, because that's something that people will relate to. So if I can toss in there, this was, it was an Apache stronghold or something, people will relate, otherwise it's difficult. Unfortunately, when you do that, yes, you draw people in, but then of course it becomes difficult to open up exactly the visa process, the legal immigration process. What exactly does it mean to migrate here? And that's a very big issue. I've navigated that process myself. I'm proudly almost to US citizenship, so I'm almost there. I'm almost navigated the entire thing. It is not an easy thing to do. And when I hear the line very often, oh, well, people who came here illegally need to go to the back of the line. Unfortunately, the way the system has been set up, for the last 20, 30 years, there sort of isn't a back of the line for people who might not have, advanced degrees or advanced skills or family here. So there's just a lot of misunderstanding of what it actually takes to navigate the process legally, let alone for people who might not have, a lot of education or literacy or resources to do that.
Well, you have an advanced degree, and you're able to, navigate that process. What are some of the advantages that were available to you because of that?
Oh, look, it's gigantic. I mean, literally just in wait list time. First of all, I was born in Italy. That in and of itself is an advantage because there are certain countries that are isolated for having too much migration. And those are, let's say, Mexico, China, India. They're put in a separate category. So to begin with, coming from Western Europe, you already have a leg up. To have an advanced degree, a PhD, that's the easiest possible route that you can take. It took me about 6 months to get my green card. It would have taken me upwards of 10 years if I had had only a bachelor's degree or were working in a job that requires only a bachelor's degree. Again, these are things that I realize are relatively boring and dry, but they really are something that is a very big part of the immigrant experience and something that unfortunately gets lost when we focus just on the dramatic images from the border.
I'd like to talk a little bit more about journalism on the border. How are cuts to investigative journalism affecting coverage of the border?
Look, unfortunately, in a very bad way, especially because as more and more US media are withdrawing for cost reasons from covering this region, it leaves the burden of responsibility on the few people who are left here, and especially in the Mexican media that are under far worse constraints because of violence, because of the threats against them. I mean, literally assassinations. As a couple of the reporters that wrote chapters about specifically this region, the Texas sort of El Paso corridor, if you will, Lourdes Cardenas, who used to be at the El Paso Times and now is here at New Mexico State University, and Liz Olson of the Houston Chronicle, they both really do a terrific job in explaining just how incredibly dangerous the border has become for a journalist to operate in. And again, the more we withdraw on the US side, the more it becomes dangerous for the few people who are left to actually pursue it. So costs are a huge issue. Another really huge issue is the new importance of audience ratings, which come in forms of not just the usual good old ratings, but every time you click, that's something that's monitored. And as people tend to focus on the more sensational and controversial things and not perhaps on the more informative investigative pieces, that gives less of an incentive to media managers to do more investigative reporting, which, let's face it, it's very costly. So that's an issue. Let me give you an example. One of our contributors is Daniel Gonzalez of the Arizona Republic. He's the immigration reporter of the Arizona Republic, has been for over 10 years. In the space of these 10 years, they used to have almost a dozen people. They came down to him, one person. They used to have people in Washington covering the federal aspect of that. They used to have people in Mexico City. And just the realities of it, despite being very good and large newspaper, they couldn't really, they've dwindled it down to himself. Now it gets even more interesting. Just this year, I believe they've rehired somebody as their border correspondent based in Phoenix, which, as you probably know, is at the very least 150 miles from the border, and that's going a really bad route down. So.
But is that something that's just really happening as a norm across the board?
It really is. It really is, and it's really happening across the media. And unfortunately, there is no really effective business model that has been found yet, and that's impacting specifically these type of stories. Now, why would it be worse for, say, covering immigration than covering anything else? In part because immigration, as Roberto Suro put it, is a story that oozes as opposed to break. Yes, sure, when there is, a spectacular, murder or something dramatic along the border, that's immediate breaking news. But really the story of this big transformation that, this program is all about, that you're talking about, how is it changing the face of America, that's a long-term story. And you can't just parachute in and out. That model really doesn't work to cover this type of news. So it's a loss that has been particularly problematic for immigration coverage.
So we have many people who may specialize in immigration but are really getting their reporting from online resources and not on the border, actually.
Exactly. I mean, for cost reasons, simply as that. I mean, it's expensive to travel to the border. It's relatively unsafe. It's perceived by many people as unsafe. And there just are fewer journalists around. I mean, the newsroom says, I've just been bleeding journalists over the last 10, 15 years.
Well, you said perception. You mentioned that. How does that perception of, say, that we may have here in the United States when we're talking about immigration or border coverage as us and them, how does that impact, media coverage?
Well, look, it's very problematic because the moment we say us versus them, we're building a little border right there. And it's also creating, sympathy effect. Are you going to sympathize or not? Are you going to see people as different because of the way they look or the way they speak, etc., versus not? When it comes to coverage, the more visible a difference is, the more of a dramatic picture it is. And I mean picture, literally image, both photographically as well as in print, the more you tend to focus on it. You focus on it, people tend to think, oh, this place is completely out of control. When I told my students that I was coming down to this region, so people are like, oh, is that safe? Are you sure you really want to go, to El Paso, maybe Juarez? Yes, of course it is. I mean, although you have to, I have precautions like in any major cities, but I think that whenever we're focusing on the most dramatic aspects, which are the quickest, the cheapest to produce, we're really doing a disservice because people perceive that there is no middle ground, that it's out of control, that it's broken, and it's all the fault of essentially either the border patrol who cannot control this or the immigrants who are breaking the law. And there's so many more players that we so rarely give a voice to. And that's, say, employers. How often do you have in immigration coverage, a focus on the demand for jobs? What exactly is going on? What do they have to go through? Very rarely. And yet, that's the biggest magnet, both here as well as in Europe.
I see. Well, you mentioned, how that could impact jobs, here in the border area, El Paso, Juarez. What happens in Juarez may have a dramatic impact on what's happening in El Paso.
Right.
I was wondering maybe if you could talk about that a little bit, about, how that does happen and could impact, say, cities that are living next to each other.
Look, one of the most fascinating things about border regions, and this is the same here as it is to Southern Europe compared to North Africa, is that really, historically speaking, they're completely interconnected. I mean, borders are a somewhat artificial thing, as somebody at some point drew a line, and that was that. But there's been an exchange of cultures, of people, of the economy. They're completely interconnected. And so obviously anything that affects one side will ultimately affect the other. You have seen this very clearly with what was called Mexodus, when in the height of the violence out of Juarez, that had a very dramatic impact on the El Paso area, and you can clearly see that reverberating across the border as well. Again, historically speaking, culturally, these are clearly very interconnected areas. What I think makes it difficult to address in the media is, again, these very long-term things. How are you going to address it? It's easy to do the narrative about one migrant who might be fleeing and that's that, but for the larger thing, how do you do that? And here is where the comparison with Europe became interesting, because they have, especially for example in the French media, they do a lot of what they call multi-genre, multi-format. So in an entire article, page on a newspaper, you'll have one article about, say, one family, but then you have a Q&A with, say, a professor, and then you might have a profile of a politician, then you might have a chart. And it's a lot broader, sort of all coming together. In the US, we do tend to focus more on a personal narrative. So we do, as journalists here, a much better job at explaining what it's like for, little Enrique to come across the border and, maybe lose his parents or be left behind or all of that, and perhaps less of a good job at addressing some of the larger structural issues that are not as dramatic, but they're very, very important.
One of the things that was obviously focused on when we're talking about, I guess what's happening in the northern border of Mexico, the southern border of the United States, is drugs and violence.
Right.
How big of an impact did the violence against journalists have on silencing the press coverage from the issues that were really going on?
Right. Well, you are, of course, I'm sure, familiar with the very famous editorial that El Diario de Juárez put out, ¿Qué quieren de nosotros? What do you want from us? Kind of an open letter to the cartels after the murder of a couple of their journalists. I can't speculate, I can't read the minds of journalists there, but obviously any type of very high intimidation of the level that we have seen along, again, the northern Mexican states is bound to have, a sort of dampening impact. And so as the violence, the really terrible coincidence has been that the violence has escalated just when the US business crisis has impacted journalists. So you have very high violence, the cost is literally your life very often. On the southern side of the border, on the northern side is just the business cost. They might not want to invest in the gasoline to go down to the border. So this mixture of cost is unfortunately creating less and less coverage, yet it's extremely important. The figures have gone down, as I'm sure you know, as far as border crossers, legal and illegal, over the last few years from the peak around 2006, 2007, because of course of the economic crisis, but they have rebounded again. So this is very much an ongoing issue. It's an extremely important issue for all of us. And that's the other point that I'd like to make. It's important, of course, for this region, but the impact goes well beyond that. In Minnesota, which is about as far as you can get, really, literally from the southern border, we're at the other border, you have entire towns that are completely being changed by the influx of Hispanic and Latino workers in the meat packing plants, in agriculture, etc. And this is something that the vastly Scandinavian population of Minnesota is really not accustomed to dealing with. So you could think of employment and language and all of these issues as, in a way, a second border. The borders move to some extent.
Well, what does that type of violence and impact have on a journalist who maybe grew up in a time where they felt like they were wearing a shield, right, because they had a press pass?
Right. This is at this point quite literally the opposite. I mean, at this point, the press pass is a target, is a bullseye in many places. And what I have heard from many reporters is that they have to cut their trips short. There are places where they literally cannot go. Literally, it's too dangerous to venture into. It is very difficult to speak to people because people, of course, are afraid. And this is a very important issue for journalists. Every journalist will tell you they're only as good as your sources. And when a population is terrified, then of course, they have all the more reasons not to actually want to talk to a reporter about what's going on. And so that also makes it that much harder to get the story out. However, it's really very heartening to me, and I try to tell this to my students who aspire to become journalists. Read these type of books because you see that people really do believe that they continue to do this job, even though it might cost them their lives. It's important that they continue to do it. And even people that travel in very dangerous areas will tell you, reporters who travel in very dangerous areas will tell you, sure, but I get out. I'm telling the story of people who are staying here, and this is far more dangerous for them, and the least I can do is to try to shine some light on it. And hopefully, airing some of the dangers, etc., might make it less acceptable to governments, to public opinion at large. So I think there's a great job for journalists to be done, and thankfully, some of these really brave people are still doing it.
Now, there are some very brave people doing this. However, there's also a lot of people that things have gotten too dangerous to where they're seeking asylum in the United States.
Yes, right. And that's another really tricky question. The whole question of refugees and asylum gets really, really tricky because it's a very special category, if you will. To the best of my knowledge, very few journalists have actually managed, Mexican journalists have actually managed to get asylum in the US. It's a very complicated process to get it. This is also very relevant, of course, in Europe, where especially after 2011 and the Arab Spring, you've really had major unrest across North Africa and the Middle East, and lots of people claiming, asylum status and coming into Europe that way. And that has generated, sadly, another wave of resentment against immigrants, as in you're trying to, jump the fence, so to speak, on the excuse of seeking asylum. Unfortunately, somehow immigration sometimes tends to bring out the worst in us, the sort of more protective kind of issue. And that's something that has also been very difficult to address in the media. You do want to give some voice to people who might have legitimate concerns about how their countries might be changing or regions. But you also don't want to, yet again, as one of the reporters put it, that all you're doing is holding a microphone to, somebody who's racist or xenophobic or, just playing to a particular audience.
I'm just curious, how tough is it for a journalist to pitch some of these stories to, their assignment editor or someone to really get some coverage on something that isn't as sensational that we're used to?
It's extremely difficult, and it's only increasingly more difficult, unfortunately, again, because of the pressures on time, where reporters are, not multitasking really, as well as the costs, as well as the fact that the non-controversial, non-sensational stories sell less. And therefore, as everybody's panicking over profits, that really doesn't help. What the journalists will tell you is that, first of all, they need to try to have some sort of hook. And whether that's, more human stories or, as I said, the reference to, the Far West, whatever it may be, that makes it popular, so to speak, they will try to do that. It is an increasingly tough sort of pitch to make. And I remember even at my time, and I left the Associated Press where I was working in 2007, so it's been a while, but it was very difficult to pitch stories, particularly on legal immigration, on the, the reform challenges and all of that. I still remember, because it was somewhat embarrassing, that it seemed an interesting reform piece came from some two rather obscure senators. And so I put a short story out on the wire, and then 2 minutes later, so people are paying attention, we got a phone call in the newsroom, and they said, I wanted to thank you for your story, but I'm calling from Senator Obama's office, and you have misspelled his first name. So, times have certainly changed. That was embarrassing, a very embarrassing mistake. But we tried to put attention, to give attention to, even smaller reform issues, things that are coming out of the legislative universe. But it's hard. The stories that sell are, the people that die in the desert, the people that drown in the boats. Unfortunately, and this is really the tragic element, there are far more people who die in the desert and drown in boats and nobody ever hears from. And those disappear and, become invisible. And that's something else that journalists are trying to dig into. But it's not hard because the odds are really against them.
I see. Well, we just have about 30 seconds. I was wondering if you could tell us what you hope this book is able to bring for people that read it.
I really hope it can bring more understanding of just what it takes to do border journalism, so they understand both the constraints on the journalists themselves, who are trying to do as good a job as they possibly can, as well as how important it is to have a more civilized, democratic debate over an issue that really impacts us all and on which we really do need to come together. There's no other way to try to address it.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us, and wish you the best of luck with the book.
Thank you, Anthony. My pleasure.
Our guest was Dr. Giovanna Dell'Orto from the University of Minnesota. I'm Anthony Moreno. This is Fronteras, A Changing America.